Drain of Wealth under Charter Acts, 1757–1947 India. If you study modern Indian history seriously for the UPSC, you quickly realize that the drain of wealth is not a slogan. It is an economic explanation for how colonial rule reshaped India's resources and ultimately transferred value from India to Britain. And the story is not confined to one decade or one governor-general. It is a long arc, beginning with the early consolidation of British power after 1757, intensifying through the Charter Acts of the 18th and 19th centuries, and continuing until 1947. Let us begin where British commercial conquest turned into territorial empire. The decisive turning point is 1757, the Battle of Plassey. After Mir Jafar's betrayal, the British East India Company gained influence and the rights to collect revenue in Bengal. That revenue was not just money, it was the lifeblood of a vast agricultural economy. Over time, as the company and later the Crown secured control, India's surplus, tax revenues, trade profits, and payments for services became a continuing source of funding for British interests. By the time of the Charter Acts, the system had a structural engine. The East India Company operated under royal charters, legal instruments that regulated trade and governance. The first important milestone is the Charter Act of 1813. It ended the company's monopoly over trade with India, but it did not end company power over the Indian economy. Instead, it marked a shift. Britain increasingly used Indian markets and Indian revenue while maintaining administrative authority. The second major milestone is the Charter Act of 1833, which renewed company control and, crucially, centralized governance under the Governor-General. This centralization mattered because it made extraction more systematic. Policy could be executed consistently across presidencies and provinces, turning local revenues into a mechanism for imperial finance. Then came the Charter Act of 1853, which further deepened the company's administrative framework. And when the Crown took over in 1858 after the Revolt of 1857, the imperial state did not abolish the logic of extraction. It expanded it. The British Raj now governed directly, but the economic purpose remained: to secure revenue for Britain's industrial and strategic needs while keeping Indian production oriented around colonial demand. So what exactly was the drain? Scholars like Dadabhai Naoroji gave the most famous formulation in his 19th century works. In his influential Poverty of India and related writings, Naoroji argued that Britain extracted wealth through multiple channels. He famously estimated India's annual drain and argued that the surplus produced in India was transferred abroad. The term drain of wealth captured this outflow: profits, pensions, interest, and the costs of administration, paid from Indian revenues and made Britain richer while limiting India's capacity for investment. R.C. Dutt, writing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, strengthened this critique through historical and economic analysis. He emphasized how British governance often prioritized the stability of imperial finance rather than Indian welfare and development. Dutt's work shows that even when railways were built, the motive was not purely economic modernization. It was also to extract raw materials, move them efficiently for British industry, and connect resource regions to ports. The railways, then, could increase extraction capacity even when they were framed as progress. Now let's break down the how in concrete mechanisms. First, taxation and land revenue. Under company and then Crown, land revenue demands remained central. Policies such as the permanent settlement in Bengal, 1793, fixed revenue payments for zamindars, but the burden of meeting those payments often fell on peasants. In other regions, alternative settlement systems maintained or increased revenue demands. The effect was to ensure a steady flow of surplus to the colonial state. When the colonial state needed funds for administration, armies, and the political order, it drew from the same base. Second, trade structure and industrial deindustrialization. Britain pushed Indian raw materials into global supply chains while restricting Indian manufacturers. Cotton textiles, for example, faced severe competition as British industrial output flooded Indian markets. Tariffs and policies were not neutral. They were shaped by the needs of British industry. This reduced India's ability to generate high-value employment and profit within its own economy. Less local manufacturing meant fewer domestic earnings and more dependence on importing British goods, creating a trade imbalance that supported outflow. Third, the manipulation of currency and capital flows. Indian revenue was used to finance British expenditures. Where British capital was invested, profits were repatriated. In effect, the colonial financial system ensured that dividends and interest often left India. Even when India earned, it frequently earned for someone else. Fourth, military expenditure and administrative costs. The imperial state required a large army not only for external defense, but also to maintain internal control. These expenses were substantial. The drain was not merely cheap goods flowing out. It was a structured payment for empire. Pensions for British officials and costs of transporting British personnel further deepened the outflow. Fifth, famines and policy failures. The most tragic part is how extraction interacted with ecological stress and market disruptions. Major famines occurred in 1770 in Bengal, 1783, 1866–67, 1876–78, and most catastrophically in 1896–97 and 1943. The famine of 1876–78 alone killed millions, and official responses often prioritized revenue and trade stability rather than relief. Market mechanisms, combined with colonial administrative priorities, could convert scarcity into catastrophe. When wealth is siphoned away and the state's priorities narrow, resilience weakens, and famine becomes more likely and more lethal. Amartya Sen, in his analysis of famines, demonstrated that famine is not only about food availability, but also about entitlement and public action. While Sen is not writing specifically within the Charter Act frame, his broader argument helps us see how colonial governance failed to provide protective institutions. In many cases, the absence or inadequacy of famine relief reflected a system that could prioritize financial and administrative imperatives over human survival. Now place these mechanisms across the timeline from 1757 to 1947. The company period established the extraction architecture after Plassey. The Charter Acts 1813, 1833, and 1853 provided legal continuity and administrative consolidation, ensuring that extraction became durable and scalable. After 1858, the Crown Raj systematized the same logic through direct control. By the early 20th century, India was deeply integrated into the global economy on colonial terms. Raw material supply, captive markets, and revenue extraction. Even the development projects served these priorities more than they served Indian long-term industrial capacity. So why does this matter for UPSC? Because the drain of wealth explains the economic foundations of political subordination. It links the modern to the colonial. It shows that British rule was not simply foreign administration. It was an economic restructuring that systematically destroyed India's capacity to grow on its own terms. In fact, the deepest injustice was not only that wealth was drained, but that the possibilities for Indian investment, industrialization, and social development were constrained from the beginning. If India is repeatedly forced into dependency through taxation, trade imbalance, and repatriation, then poverty and underdevelopment are not accidents. They are outcomes of policy. And that brings us to a closing thought. When you measure history only by political milestones, you miss the machinery of extraction. The drain of wealth reminds us that power can move through laws, revenues, and trade routes, and that justice in history requires us to follow where the money went. Because the true question is not only how Britain ruled India, but what India was made to become in the process.